This is NBC News special coverage of the Republican National Convention. Live from Milwaukee, here is Tom Llamas.
We are live tonight from Milwaukee as the final night of the Republican National Convention kicks off. Right now, we're just hours away from the grand finale. Former President Trump set to accept the Republican nomination in a primetime address. A live look at the convention stage where Trump will speak for the first time since the assassination attempt on his life. We're told the former president wrote his own speech, tearing up his original remarks he called a humdinger, after the shooting, which we will hear from a different version of Trump on what we've never heard before. That's the big question tonight. It comes as the current state of our political parties couldn't be more polarized as Republicans fall in line, unified under former President Trump. Democrats increasingly growing farther apart. Right now, President Biden back at home in Delaware, self-isolating with COVID, now further isolated from his own party. An avalanche of breaking headlines today. The president, inner circle, and top Democrats turn up the pressure on him to leave the race. One person close to the president telling NBC News, quote, "We're close to the end." That's a devastating quote. And former President Obama reportedly telling allies Biden's path to victory has diminished. Back in Milwaukee, the final night of the convention ending in a smackdown. Retired wrestler Hulk Hogan and UFC President Dana White addressing the crowd this evening. Also speaking, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, and Trump's son, Eric Trump. You might be wondering where former First Lady Melania Trump has been. Though she's been notably absent during much of his campaign, we're told she is expected to join her husband in a rare appearance tonight. Our reporters are spread out across the convention floor, and our political experts standing by as this historic evening unfolds. Garrett Haake joins us now from the RNC floor, perched just above it. Garrett, walk our viewers through what they can expect tonight and how former President Trump is going to be introduced.
Tom, I appreciate the SmackDown reference because I do think we're going to see something of a pugilistic tone, at least from the early slate of speakers here this evening. You mentioned former pro wrestler Hulk Hogan is set to address the crowd. So, too, is Dana White, the chairman of the UFC. The other person I'm very interested in tonight is Tucker Carlson. Once a host on Fox News, now runs his own media outlet. Kind of the de facto media spokesperson for the MAGA movement. Much more sympathetic towards Russia, certainly, than Ukraine. Much more populist outlook on the economy than traditional Republicans. Someone who has been a supporter of Donald Trump's in public, although has criticized him in private, and very much a player behind the scenes in the MAGA movement and reportedly instrumental in the selection of J.D. Vance to join this ticket. His remarks are circled on my program for sure. And we're going to have Eric Trump, obviously the former president's younger son, speaking tonight. He is not taking as much of a political role as Donald Trump Jr. or certainly Ivanka and Jared, who had served in the last administration, but has emerged recently as more of a player in his father's orbit. And, of course, the acceptance speech from Donald Trump tonight, who does have to walk this rhetorical tightrope between the unity that his campaign says he intends to espouse tonight, try to capture the correct tone and feeling in the country in the wake of the assassination attempt on his life, but also take it to Joe Biden. You can probably see the Fire Joe Biden signs in the crowd around me on the floor here tonight. I do not expect Donald Trump to pull any punches tonight, and so how he both wraps his arms around the country and throws haymakers at Joe Biden and the Democratic agenda, I think, is a very difficult task for him that we will see how he's able to accomplish tonight.
Garrett, I do want to ask you, tonight's going to be a night that a lot of America is going to be watching former President Trump. It's the first time he addresses an audience this large since that assassination attempt. A lot of people are asking, are we going to see a change in Trump? What do you expect? You've been covering him for a while. And how do Republicans sort of make sure there's still pressure and focus on the Democrats and the disarray that's happening in their party while also trying to sell their message?
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. When it comes to Trump, he's a 78-year-old man. My instinct is that I think it'll be very difficult for him to change, and I think there's evidence that shows that that is the case. For example, on his social media platform, if you look at his Truth Social posts in the days after the assassination attempt and the days before, when he talks about Democrats, when he talks about his political opponents, he uses the same kind of rhetoric, the same kind of name-calling, the same kind of sort of more nasty tone towards his opponents now that he did before. I don't think he has entirely turned over a new leaf, but as several of the delegates I've spoken to on the floor, and as some of his allies have told me in the halls and corridors here, if anything can change a man, assassin's bullet could be the thing to do it. As for how they take advantage of the Democrat situation, I think that's very much an open question. The Trump campaign strategy leading up to this convention had been to basically stay out of the way, to not interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And the idea that Democrats were kind of flailing, that's not a night that Republicans can make any darker for them. Now, I do think in fact, I can tell you for certain that we've seen in the last several weeks stepped up attacks on Kamala Harris, the vice president, sort of trying to soften her up should she end up at the top of the ticket. But beyond that, I don't know that that strategy will change now. If Joe Biden and the Democrats are struggling, very little said on this stage can make their problems worse.
All right, Garrett Hake leading us off in this hour. Garrett, we appreciate it. For more on what we can expect from former President Trump's big speech tonight and the state of the Biden campaign, let's bring in our political pros tonight. Mark Lauder, former strategic communications director of the Trump 2020 campaign, and Alencia Johnson. She's a former advisor to the Biden 2020 campaign. Alencia, I'm going to start with you. We have this graphic that I have been asking for and using over the last 2 hours because it's just stunning when you see it. It is sort of, if you will, right now the Mount Rushmore of the Democratic Party. If we can put that on the screen there, a lot of very big Democrats who the reporting is are breaking with President Biden. My question to you is the same I asked Simone a couple of hours ago. Do you think the question is not if, but when President Biden drops out?
I think the question is whether or not President Biden is actually going to listen to the party elites or if he is going to listen to some of the things that we're hearing on the ground from voters. Listen, I think a lot of people are waiting with bated breath for him to make his final decision. But one of the things that I have been saying all over the networks when it comes to this conversation is that there is a disconnect among the party. I hate that our dirty laundry is out here. The disconnect is there are those in positions of power in the party as well as those who are on the media like myself. There are also elite folks who are talking about he should drop out. And yet at the same time, you pointed some elected officials who, you showed some elected officials who it has been said that they are talking to him about dropping out. But you know who is still standing with him? The elected officials that are members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. You also have a lot of progressive elected officials, such as Senator Sanders, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, AOC, and the list goes on, as well as a significant portion of Black and Latino voters who may not be super excited about President Biden as the candidate, but they understand that this chaos is actually keeping us from doing the actual work we need to do in order to get voters to turn out. The reality is it's not a choice between Biden and Trump. It's a choice between Biden and the couch. And there are so many folks closest to the coalition of our voting base who know that all of this time that we are wasting is keeping us away from doing the work that we need to, and that is to get these people to turn out. So it's a matter of when he makes the decision to firmly plant his feet and say, I'm the nominee, or he does not.
Alencia, we thank you for that. Mark Lauder, I want to bring you into this conversation. You know, the Trump campaign has already taken advantage of this, right? Trump's campaign manager saying that Democrats have been campaigning on a threat to democracy, that former President Trump is a threat to democracy, and now they want to deny the 14 million people that voted in the primaries. Is this a big problem for Democrats?
Absolutely. And the fact that they're still doing this, we're 114 days or something like that away from the election. And how many times does Joe Biden say he is the nominee, including Monday in Las Vegas? He keeps repeating it, and people keep saying, well, let's make a final decision. I mean, sounds like he has, but they don't like it. And, I mean, I get it. The polls are disastrous. You now have polls out. I think Donald Trump has pulled ahead of President Biden in the Commonwealth of Virginia in the Real Clear Politics average. I mean, the map is expanding. It's not good for Democrats. But I'm not sure if changing the horse, changing the name on the bumper sticker is going to do anything, because Kamala Harris is going to run on the same policies.
Yeah. Alencia, I do want to ask you, we have some reporting from our Mike Memoli about how the Biden-Harris team is responding to sort of all the Democratic leaders that are having these conversations. If we have those quotes, we can put them up on the screen. And if we don't, just let me know, guys, and I'll walk Alencia through them. I'll walk on. Here, okay, here we go. This is from the Biden-Harris team, a source telling NBC News. Can we all just remember for a minute that these same people who are trying to push Joe Biden out are the same people who literally gave us Donald Trump? In 2015, Obama, Pelosi, Schumer pushed Biden aside in favor of Hillary. They were wrong then, and they are wrong now. Those are some tough words, and they're actually not wrong, coming from a source close to President Biden that spoke to NBC News. Do you think that's going to be sort of the mantra, and that's what they're going to be telling people going forward?
Listen, they are not wrong with that statement, but I will say I think this tone is part of the frustration that a lot of people within the party are having. It is this tone of shut up and get along versus why don't we actually all come to the table and realize what are some of our concerns as well as what is our shared goal, because we actually have more in common than we disagree on, and how do we create what we always talk about, this big coalition that supports democracy where people are able to criticize their elected officials, they're able to dissent, and yet understand that the win is more important than being right. And so I understand that this posturing, right, the wins that they have on the board, like the proof is helping them make this decision, but it is that tone that is ostracizing so much of our base, and again, not allowing for us to actually move forward and put forward the agenda that we actually have to move this country forward. We understand that we can't just talk about being against Project 2025 and this anti-abortion uprise or this movement on the right, but we can talk about what we want to do collectively, not with this hard tone that is actually turning a lot of voters off.
Right. Mark Lauder, we look out at the convention floor now. Diana Hendricks, she's a businesswoman, one of the everyday Americans that Republicans wanted convention goers and Americans to hear from. I do want to ask you, you're also going to hear from Hulk Hogan tonight. Kid Rock's going to perform. This is not the same Republican Party that you probably grew up with. You've been to a few conventions. I mean, Hulk Hogan being one of the headliners is quite interesting.
You don't see the Chamber of Commerce and the Country Club here, do you?
Right,
No.
right.
I mean, but I think that shows that Donald Trump is expanding the base of the Republican Party. It includes a lot of white, hard-working Americans. They love their UFC fights. They love WWE. And so as this party is growing, you see it reflected there on the stage, whether it's, growing with black communities, Hispanic communities, immigrants, labor union members. That's Donald Trump, and the polls are reflecting it.
How do you think Senator J.D. Vance did yesterday? He didn't, necessarily blow the roof off the place, but did you think he accomplished what he wanted to?
I think he did. It was an introductory speech. And I think when he was talking about his story and his mama and the 19 guns and all those things, you can see people kind of being drawn in. I can tell, obviously, because of his background telling his story, that he's very good at that. And
you think it was memorable?
I think it was memorable as an introduction. Yeah. And he will obviously continue to do that, and obviously the red meat of the politics and the policy, that's coming out tonight right before the balloons. Yeah. And but I think he's going to be a great addition to the ticket.
Dana White is maybe not a person that all of America knows. If you follow UFC, you know who Dana White is, but that's, I would argue, the male voters who probably already love former President Trump, that are Republicans and or independents, who they may be. But I do want to ask you, why do you think Dana White is introducing or is going to be the speaker just before former President Trump?
I think he's a fighter, and I think that's really one of the themes that you're going to have, and it's fighting for America first. You're also going to have Kid Rock. You're going to have so it's really a blue collar introduction,
anti-elitist,
blue collar introduction to the blue collar billionaire president.
Yeah, you worked with former President Trump. You know him pretty well. How would you judge his demeanor over the last few days?
I haven't actually seen him in person, but everything I've seen, my colleague or former colleagues are telling me that this has changed him. When you come a millimeter or two away from the end, it's going to have that effect, and I think you're going to see it tonight. I've seen reported that the name Biden is not even used in tonight's speech.
Wow. Former Vice President Mike Pence, you worked with him as well. You know him well. What is he doing this week? Kind of strange he's not here, huh?
I saw on Twitter that he's in Montana fishing and and horseback riding.
Yeah. Are there lessons that you think Senator J.D. Vance could learn if this ticket wins from Mike Pence?
I would have no question that at some point, I don't know if J.D. Vance reached out or if the former vice president reaches out, that they would connect. Look, when he was going through this, he talked to all the previous Republican nominees, whether they were successful or not. Yeah. They got lessons learned. Obviously, there was a transition project, and all of the vice presidents, Democrat and Republican, came in as he was preparing to enter the White House, and I'm sure that he would be the first one to stand in line to help J.D. Vance as a candidate and also as the incoming vice president.
Yeah. Alencia, going back to you, you've worked on campaigns that have helped elect people to the highest offices in our country. How does all these problems with the Democratic Party sort of change the programming for Democrats when they're trying to figure out their convention? It's about a month away in Chicago, but do you think those conversations are still being hashed out?
Look, absolutely. I think what is happening now is behind the scenes, folks are trying to figure out what is the best way for us to actually show unity. Once we get through these past 3 weeks, when I think we will get there, we have another 4 weeks until our convention, we're going to show the actual real diversity and unity of America. Mark mentioned immigrants supporting Donald Trump. I'm sorry, they had up signs last night that said, deport them now, right? Mass deportations now. We are actually not going to do that. We are going to continue to bring all factions of our coalition together. And I think what we saw at the RNC will be a stark contrast to what we will see at the DNC, the diversity of thought, opinion, of backgrounds, of age. That is going to come together at the convention. And I have a feeling, in the ways that we've been able to do in the past, even through all of the mess these past 3 weeks, we will be able to figure that out. And party leadership is thinking about that, which is part of the reason you see some of these soundings of the alarm so urgently right now, so that we can get back on course to that.
Mark Lauder, final night of the convention. Do conventions still matter?
I think they do for both parties. I mean, you basically have every major news outlet, both broadcast and cable, online here.
But we live in such a crazy news cycle. I mean, do you think anything will be remembered from this?
I think people will get their sound bites, their clips. They'll see it on social media. They'll see it, obviously, on their streaming devices. And I think it's a great chance for both political parties in America to put their best foot forward and what they hope to do. Once Democrats can figure out what they want to do, I'm sure they'll get to focusing on their convention.
Do you think we will get a vice presidential debate between Senator J.D. Vance and Kamala Harris?
If Kamala Harris is the vice presidential nominee, then yes. But if it's someone else, then I think that they will schedule it as soon as we know who that person will be and they're nominated.
You think they're just going to wait until further down the calendar?
Yeah,
that's what you would advise.
Once we know that Kamala Harris is going to be either vice presidential or presidential nominee, then that's when we'll schedule the vice presidential debate.
I want to dip into the convention floor. Diane Evans is speaking right now. She's one of the everyday Americans that Republicans wanted Americans to hear from. Let's listen in.
He isn't part of the swamp. He's going to drain the swamp. The Democrats are going to do everything in their power to stop him. We can't rest for a minute. If you're not sure how to get involved, reach out to your local Republican Party. And most important, get out and vote Republican on November 5th. Tell 20 people to tell 20 people to vote. That's how we can get our landslide. And they can't cheat or rig their way out of a landslide. I know that together we can win. We can all take out the garbage in Washington, D.C. And we can make America great again. God bless President Trump. And God bless Team Trump. And thank you so much. I'll see you all out there.
We've been listening to the Republican National Convention there. We were just listening to Diane Evans, one of the everyday Americans. In about a minute or two, we're going to hear from Linda McMahon. You may remember her. She was the former wife of Vince McMahon, who ran the WWF, which turned into the WWE. But she, of course, worked for former President Trump as the administrator of the Small Business Administration. She was seated next to former President Trump yesterday in the VIP box as they were watching Senator J.D. Vance's speech. She's had a close relationship with the former president. Mark Lauder, I know you know her well. Talk to me about the relationship between the McMahons, at least Linda McMahon and former President Trump.
Well, the relationship goes back well before he got into politics, when they were building WWE into an icon. And he's a huge wrestling fan, as we have seen that the president still goes to UFC fights and goes to WrestleMania, to a huge response. Linda was an amazing small business administrator, because WWE, well, it isn't now. It did start as a small business and grew into a billion-dollar enterprise, multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And so she's a great small business person. She traveled the country just talking, what can we do to make your small business successful?
She's tried to run for Senate, though, a couple times, right? And it's been difficult, but she's been running in the state of Connecticut.
In Connecticut, yeah. Difficult uphill climb, but, she's got a servant's heart.
She's into politics.
Correct. She's a servant's heart, and she was actually one of the few small business administrators that was actually a member of the cabinet.
Kristen Davis joins us now here as well, part of our live team of political pros that is talking about the convention. Kristen, your take so far on the convention, and what do you want to hear from former President Trump?
Well, I think what we're going to hear from the former president is what we've been hearing all week: a lot of momentum, a lot of excitement, and a lot of unity. I mean, look at a tale of two parties. You have the Republican Party, who's unified, excited, has momentum, while you have the Democrat Party that's, frankly, the party of chaos right now. And so I'm really excited for the president's speech. I think it's going to be very inspiring. I think it's going to bring a lot of people who if you're not on the boat right now, you're going to be on the boat tonight.
We're going to have to wait and see. Kristen, I'm going to pause you right there so we can take to the stage and listen to Linda McMahon.
Well, hello, Milwaukee, and good evening, America. Let me take 1 second to say hello to my fellow delegates from Connecticut. My name is Linda McMahon, and I am the chair of the America First Policy Institute. I'm perhaps one of the few people who's been privileged to call Donald Trump a colleague and a boss, but he's also a friend. Let me share a little story that's probably not the typical Donald Trump story. I had a meeting scheduled with him at Mar-a-Lago. And as he welcomed me, his little 4-year-old granddaughter ran up to him. He scooped her up with delight and asked her, "Who's the most beautiful girl in the world?" And she said, "Me." Then he asked, "And who do you love the most in the world?" And she said, "You, Grandpa." And he kissed her on both cheeks. Then she whisked off his hat and mussed his hair. And he smiled with the love that only a grandfather could have given. I first met Donald Trump when I was the CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment. For fun, he became part of some of the most compelling and highest-rated storylines in the company's history. And when he became president, I was honored to serve in his cabinet, running the Small Business Administration. I traveled the country, talking to business owners and job creators. They knew they had a president who understood them and fought for them. He knew that small businesses are the engine of the American economy, and the Trump tax cuts proved to be like rocket fuel for them. Almost every business owner I spoke with was using their tax savings to grow their businesses. And ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. economy was flourishing. But at no moment during my time in the government was more poignant for me than one that happened in 2018. I traveled with the president to view the destruction which Hurricane Florence had levied on my hometown of New Bern, North Carolina. I stepped off of Air Force One and walked side by side with the President of the United States through the hangar where my father had been a shop foreman and my mom had been a budget analyst. I watched Donald Trump walk through neighborhoods of my childhood, comforting those who had suffered such great damages. Because he was a builder, he talked to them about what it would take to rebuild, what kind of materials they should use. And he didn't just show a personal interest, he was one of them. But now Joe Biden and the Democrats want to penalize small businesses again by hiking their taxes. But when he's reelected, Donald Trump will make those tax cuts permanent. And he will also offer new tax cuts like no taxes on tips. Instead of taxing American companies, Donald Trump put tariffs on China that raised billions of dollars and protected American industries. And if reelected, he'll do it again. President Trump is a job creator and the best friend American workers have ever had in the White House. He is a champion of the forgotten men and women, as I have experienced firsthand. But the media doesn't like to acknowledge that very often. Donald Trump is not only a fighter, ladies and gentlemen, he is a good man. He has the heart of a lion and the soul of a warrior. And I believe that if necessary, he would stand at the gates of hell to defend our country. He loves this country, and he would do anything to defend it and to protect us from all harm. I am confident that he will make America great again. And why? Because he did it before. So I ask all of you here tonight, and those of you who are watching from home, to re-elect Donald J. Trump as the 47th President of the United States. Thank you, and good night.
We have just been listening there to Linda McMahon, former small business administrator under former President Trump. We're waiting for the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to take the stage. While we wait, Chris, I wanted to ask you again, who are some of the more memorable speeches you think over the last week? We were talking about this during the break.
Well, I think everyone's done a great job, but I think Governor Huckabee Sanders from Arkansas, I think she brought the House down. It was a great mix of empathy, personal connection with the president and also just excitement for the future. I think Senator Tim Scott, Senator Marco Rubio, Governor DeSantis, Governor Youngkin, everyone did a really great job, all sticking with the theme that, we are now, everything's different today than it was last Friday. Really puts it into perspective, really grateful that President Trump is okay. And I think the renewed sense of unity that our party has is something that I don't think we've seen in maybe 2 decades. And so every speaker is doing a great job of really personifying it from the stage. So I think
do you think Senator J.D. Vance delivered for the ticket? And do you think he delivered the speech that former President Trump wanted?
I think he did. People are going to get to know Senator Vance over the next few months. Yeah. They're going to read the book. They're going to watch the movie. And it's going to be, he gave us a little bit of that last night with his mom in the box. It was such a moment when he, shouted out to his mom. I think everyone in the country thought of their own mom or grandma at that moment.
It was funny when people started chanting JD's mom, JD's mom. Great. It was kind of funny.
Yeah.
Something that was a little different. About tonight, and speaking about former President Trump, there has been sort of this softening, if you will, of the former president. We saw his granddaughter come out. You mentioned Governor Huckabee Sanders talking about this side that maybe a lot of American voters don't see, if ever. I do want to ask you, do you think that's intentional, and do you think it's to appeal to some female voters that other strategists have made that point?
I think it is. I think we've seen this entire campaign, a different campaign and a very disciplined and strategic campaign, and I think that is part of it. I mean, the thing with with Donald Trump is even before he ran the first time, he had been in everyone's living rooms for years. And so everyone thought they knew him. And now seeing him as the grandfather, I thought his granddaughter stole the show last night.
Yeah. Mark Lauder, for you, Democrats getting ready for their convention in a month, watching this convention here, it could be something completely different than we've ever seen before if there's no nominee and Vice President Kamala Harris ends up on the top of the ticket.
I mean, the process is going to be wild. It's not something that, we've seen since, the 1960s was the last time there was an open party convention. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the various factions of the Democrat Party come together. I mean, the progressives, where are they going to go? Obviously, you have the black coalitions, you have the Hispanic and Latinos, you have the Bernie bros. I mean, are they going to come back and think this is their time? Is Hillary going to throw her name in the ring?
Do you think former President Trump does a lot more campaigning? And the reason why I ask is, one, you have the Democrats in disarray, but two, he almost lost his life. And do you think that changes the team strategy at all?
No, in fact, what I think they're going to, I would suggest is that go into the policy side of it. Talk about why we don't have a candidate, assuming that the president removes himself from the ballot, then go to the grocery stores, the gas stations, the border.
You're talking about Trump doing that?
Have Trump do that. Talk about the issues that matter, because you don't have an opponent to attack. So talk about the things that the American people actually want you to talk about. The attacks will come later.
Kristen, some Democrats have been making the arguments to President Biden that it's hard to raise money. You work for a super PAC for Governor DeSantis. How important is it, at least in this stretch, to make sure you have enough money to get you to the finish line?
Well, there's an old saying that winning campaigns don't run out of money. And right now, I think we see that playing out with President Biden's campaign. You read articles about $96 million on lock because, they don't have confidence in him. A successful campaign, people will want to support it, both with their vote and with their resources. Right now, if I'm a Democrat donor, I don't see a good investment in investing in the Biden campaign. Frankly, if Biden stays on top of the ticket, is those resources divert down ballot. Democrats will kind of give up on top of the ticket and focus on Senate races and congressional. The problem there is that those candidates aren't doing well either. You see Democrat incumbents across the country in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, New Mexico, Arizona, underperforming, all under 50%. I think that Donald Trump right now is leading a potential wave throughout, down ballot across states and states that we haven't won in a generation, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and really building out, when you have Republicans winning in states like New Mexico and Virginia and Minnesota, that the alarm bells should be going off. And if I'm a Democrat donor, I'm not giving $5 to that campaign.
And if I can, Tom, one thought on that. If the map is expanding and, say, New Jersey and New York are suddenly close, Washington, D.C., the suburbs, Virginia, those are not cheap markets to have to play defense in. And if you're already struggling for cash, it's a nightmare for whomever.
We know that Jeffrey Katzenberg, who is the Hollywood mogul, who's been raising a lot of money for President Biden up to this point, has also had those hard conversations with President Biden, according to reporting, saying that it's getting harder and harder to raise money. If you're trying to physically raise money and you're having these problems, what is your pitch to people?
Honestly, if I'm a bundler for the Democrat Party, I say we got to go save the Senate. That's honestly, I don't see right now how you can honestly tell a donor that it's time to keep giving to the party. And frankly, even if they change the top of the ticket, they had problems before that first debate. Democrats were losing before that first debate, and it's because Republicans under Donald Trump have been talking in human terms and kitchen table issues, while Biden has been looking at a chart saying Bidenomics is working for the last 2 years, and it hasn't been. So I think the case is very hard to make for a Democrat bundler, and if I were them, I would be turning my attention to the Senate and to the House. They have problems there too, but if this is a year where they're facing a total wash, they got to try to save their resources somewhere.
Valencia Johnson worked on the 2020 Biden-Harris campaign. They were very successful. They were able to win that campaign and put President Biden in the White House. Valencia, you heard the conversation here. If President Biden stays the nominee, how does he turn it around?
Listen, I think there's there's a lot of ways for Democrats to turn this around. One of the things that was not brought up is this issue of abortion. And abortion has been a winning issue for Democrats, even in red states, ever since the Dobbs decision. We are also finding that as more voters are hearing about Project 2025, that is galvanizing them as well. The Supreme Court's extreme positions, handing over, complete, total agency to a president, right, giving him total immunity, that is actually galvanizing our base. And so Democrats have an opportunity to talk about a lot of the extreme positions that the Republican Party has taken, whether or not they want to talk about them on the stages. It's been very interesting to watch that the Republican Party, particularly J.D. Vance last night, not even mention the word abortion when we know his extreme positions. And that has been the issue that is driving the wedge between Democrats and Republicans and made Donald Trump a losing top-of-the-ticket endorser
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pause
in 2022.
Excuse me, I have to pause you. We want to listen to Secretary Mike Pompeo.
To serve as President Trump's Director and Secretary of State. It was my greatest honor to work with him every single day to serve you, the American people. Now you all are paying attention, so you know what the Trump administration achieved, but it's worth going through a few of these accomplishments. Let's start with this. There were no new American wars. Our border, our southern border, closed. It may seem like a long time ago, but when we took office, there were people's heads being cut off at the beaches. We destroyed ISIS and its caliphate. And here's another fun fact. We never lost our Secretary of Defense for 2 weeks either. You'll remember, for those 4 years, the evil of Vladimir Putin was held at bay. When we walked out, January of 2021, the Iranian regime was afraid, and the people of Israel were strong and secure, and we treated them like the friend and ally that they need to be. Everywhere we went, religious freedom was protected. We held 3 summits in North Korea, and North Korea was quieted. We'd begun an honorable exit from Afghanistan, and not a single Chinese spy balloon flew across the United States of America. 4 years. Had I been the Secretary of State and a Chinese spy balloon flew across our country, I would have been the former Secretary of State, and rightfully so. Under President Trump, the Chinese Communist Party, which to this day presents the greatest threat to our nation from outside of our country, we confronted it like never before. Look, ladies and gentlemen, in short, we put America first every single day. "42 months on, what has Joe Biden and Kamala Harris done? And their leftist handles, what have they delivered to us for security and prosperity? Almost nothing. Let's start with this. You saw some of them last night. 13 new Gold Star families from Afghanistan. As an Army veteran, I want to speak to everybody who served in Afghanistan. I'm disgusted by the Biden administration's incompetent pullout from that country. To those of you who served there, know this. Know that your service was honorable, that you saved American lives, and that the Pompeos love and admire you for what you did for America. Thank you, and God bless each and every one of you. Every one of you has served in uniform, and the families of those, you deserve a president who will not check his watch while he is honoring our fallen brothers and sisters. It was indecent. And of course, it was that very weakness we saw in Afghanistan that prompted Putin's butchery in Ukraine. Last week, we saw what it meant. A children's hospital bombed, innocents killed. It did not have to be. And now, of course, a second war in Gaza. President Biden won't even talk about the fact that Americans are still being held there by the Iranian regime. Contrast that with what we did when Americans were wrongfully held. President Trump sent me to North Korea to bring home 3 American pastors. We brought them home along with dozens of other hostages, and we did so without paying one single penny to the terrorists. And what about Iran today? When Joe Biden eased up on President Trump's maximum pressure campaign, we gave money to the Ayatollah so he could cut more checks to the genocidal maniacs who conducted barbaric attacks in Israel. And now, of course, closer to home, a massive national security challenge. Our southern border is a welcome mat. It's a welcome mat for Islamist terrorists, drug dealers, Chinese spies, and violent criminals. Ladies and gentlemen, President Biden sold out our citizens and our security and our sovereignty, and we need to get it back, and I am confident that we will get it back. I had this incredible privilege to serve as your top diplomat. I saw how the world always looks to our nation as the unrivaled example of what a free society should look like. But unfortunately, President Biden struts the global stage. Maybe I should say he shuffles the global stage. He talks a big game about American values. But what's he done at home? What's he shown the world? What have he and his leftist base actually shown other nations? He's censored free speech here at home. He's put woke into the military that I and you so desperately love. We must reclaim it. He put it in our schools as well. He's weaponized the justice system against our political opponents. And even to this day, as we sit here today, he and Vice President Harris are providing appeasement to the pro-Hamas radicals on our streets here inside the United States. And even worse, today this administration treats illegals better than our own citizens. That is indecent. And the entire administration has failed to tell us the truth that we all know and is so dangerous to our nation. The truth that Joe Biden can't handle that 3 a.m. phone call. Indeed, he won't take a phone call after about 4 p.m. My call to you tonight is really straightforward. It's really simple. We can't trust the Biden administration, and that means we have work to do to uphold American values. It is up to those of us in the room tonight and those of you watching tonight. Donald Trump will every day, I saw it firsthand, he will put America first. So let's do what's right and what's important. Let's elect a president who isn't ashamed of our nation and will never apologize for our country. And when we do, we will put a strong America First leader back in the White House. We'll re-elect Donald J. Trump, and we will make America special, exceptional, and of course, great again. Thank you. God bless you. God bless our veterans and the United States of America. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pastor Lorenzo Sewell.
We have just been listening to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Vaughn Hillyard is down there on the convention floor listening to the former Secretary's speech. Vaughn, you know, Secretary Pompeo is such an interesting figure in Republican politics because a lot of people thought he was going to run for president. That never materialized.
and we were blessed.
There was a lot of administration officials from the first Trump administration that broke from Donald Trump over those 4 years, from General John Kelly to former secretaries of defense, as well as Rex Tillerson, his initial Secretary of State. But what you saw in Mike Pompeo was somebody who left the administration after serving initially as CIA director, and the two had maintained a close relationship. He had considered running for president himself, and one of the reasons why some thought that he may have some credibility and potential to perform all right in a Republican primary was the fact that Donald Trump had repeatedly praised him, had not ever attacked him upon leaving administration. But when Donald Trump jumped into the race, it was quite clear the direction of where the Republican primary was going to go was going to be a crowded field, and Pompeo declined to go forward with his own ambitions and his own run. And consequently, you could very well expect a Secretary Pompeo, who has publicly suggested he would be open to serving in the administration again, rejoining Donald Trump in January of 2025. Now, notably, at the beginning of Russia's aggression into war into Ukraine, this is somebody who had previously been more of a foreign policy military hawk, but somebody who had called Vladimir Putin shrewd. It was played on Russian state media, and at the beginning of that war, it was led to much criticism of Mike Pompeo. But I think that this is where you see Donald Trump and him have a very similar view of the U.S.'s military role overseas. And what from the speech you just heard, Tom, was not only the criticism of the Afghanistan withdrawal, in which 13 American service members lost their lives. Folks will recall that the Trump administration with Mike Pompeo were the ones that began to make those initial moves to prepare for the withdrawal. But it was that chaotic withdrawal that ultimately was a devastating video to watch. It was frantic, chaotic, and an own internal report from the State Department noted the faults of the Biden administration that led to those 13 deaths. But also you heard him from the stage note the administration under Trump was one that did not see Russian aggression into Ukraine or Hamas make the sort of all hands-on-deck attack on Israel that we saw happen in this last October. And so for Mike Pompeo, he is somebody who has remained an ardent, a loyal ally to Donald Trump, has left much of his criticism off from the public sight. And I think that that is why you saw Donald Trump choose to have him here just a mere 2 hours before Donald Trump is to take the stage himself, invite his former Secretary of State and perhaps a cabinet member in 2025 back onto the stage.
Vaughn, stand by for us. We appreciate that. I want to dip into the convention floor. Pastor Lorenzo Sewell is getting a lot of applause here. Let's listen to hear what he's saying.
Praying in the name of Jesus changes everything. And when we prayed for President Trump, only God knew that 30 days later, there would be a miracle by a millimeter. Only God knew that if we prayed for him during his birthday, there would be a miracle by a millimeter. If President Trump had moved 1 millimeter, he wouldn't have been here on Monday to talk to us about how America was going to be made wealthy again. If President Donald Trump would have moved just a millimeter, he wouldn't have been here on Tuesday to talk about how he was going to make America secure again. If President Donald Trump would have moved just a millimeter, he wouldn't have been here on Wednesday to tell us how he was going to make America strong again. And if President Trump would have moved just a millimeter, we will not be hearing tonight how he was going to make America great again. Before I take my seat, I just got to talk to you about something called providence and something called sovereignty. God's sovereignty is his ability to be able to do what he wants when he wants because he's God. And God's providence, it's when he does what he wants, when he wants for all of you. Did you know that President Trump was shot on 6/11? And do you know that Ephesians chapter number 6, verse number 11 says, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. To all my Democrat friends, I want to ask you one question. Do you know anybody that was the 45th president? He was convicted of 34 accounts. He raised $53 million in 24 hours and could be the 47th president of the United States in America. And he was shot one time. Do you know anybody like that?
We've just been listening to Lorenzo Sewell, a religious leader, speaking to the crowd here in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. We're expecting President Trump at any moment to enter the convention hall. He's going to listen to some of the speeches here, including some from personal friends. And we are just hours away from when he's going to take the stage here. Former President Trump, of course, is going to tell his mission and his vision on where he's going to take this Republican Party tonight. Former Illinois Congressman Rodney Davis joins us now live on set, and Tara Palmieri, she's a senior political correspondent at Puck News. We thank you both for being here. Tara, I'm going to start with you. I know you have some new reporting for Puck. What can you share with our viewers?
I was told from senior Hill source that it's not a matter of if Joe Biden steps down, it's a matter of when. There is a sustained campaign going on in the Hill, and it's being led by Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. I was told, quote, Nancy is historically always a first mover on legislation, and Schumer is always a closer. There's no one person who's going to be the person who did it. It's going to be collective pressure. So what I'm being told from my sources is that it's unsustainable for Joe Biden to stay in the race, that this will not end, and that he's just handled dealing with the Hill in such a terrible way. Members feeling like their concerns aren't being listened to. As we know, Chuck Schumer met with him last week, and at the time they thought that they had really broken some ground with him, but it's not over.
Yeah. This place going absolutely bonkers for the speech you just heard. Rodney, I'm going to bring it over to you. How do Republicans use this to an advantage? You know, there's a lot of bad news for Democrats right now. It's a tough time for the party and for President Biden while he's battling COVID. And yet you're having a convention this week. So how do you sort of make sure you can wrestle back the narrative?
Well, first off, I think this convention has helped show the American people that Republicans are more unified than we've been in a generation. Democrats clearly are not. You have power brokers like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer trying to push the sitting president of the United States out of this race. If he is not well enough to be a candidate for president, how is he well enough to be the president of the United States? Americans aren't going to stand for backroom deals that the Democrats are putting together right now.
Yeah, Tara, what are you hearing from your Republican sources about this convention so far and what we can expect from former President Trump?
Well, I've been told that, obviously they ripped up the original speech. It's a more powerful speech. It's more, emotive. He did just survive, a near-death experience. I heard you're going to hear less like crooked Joe Biden kind of language, but it's going to be a clear contrast as much as they can on policy. And eventually I'm sure Trump will fall into his Trumpisms. But at least from the outset, what he starts with is going to have a different tone than what we're expecting. Listen, like everyone is excited right now. It feels like a victory party, but I know everyone is also holding their breath. They know that they are going to have to craft a different campaign around a candidate that is not Joe Biden, right? Yeah. And I spoke to Trump's political director just 2 days ago, and he said, we're ready for any candidate. And, we're ready for any candidate that's not Joe Biden, but it's hard to believe.
Tara, I was listening to you. I was looking over because we know at any moment former President Trump's going to walk into the convention floor right now. I got to tell you, if we can take some live pictures of the floor, I haven't seen it this packed yet. It obviously makes sense. It's the last night of the convention, but it is filled to the brim. How you doing? People are waving us here in our studio overlooking overlooking the convention floor. And it sounds like he's about to walk in. If we can take that feed of him coming in, that'd be great, guys. There we go. Hillyard. You know what, guys? Let's keep listening in. We've been watching former President Trump there saying hello to Senator Ted Cruz and others. Vaughn Hillyard is right down there. Vaughn, walk us through what we just listened and heard right there.
Donald Trump, upon walking in, Tom, he just shook the hands of the individuals who would be his key allies in the U.S. Senate. You saw John Barrasso in the second row behind him. John Barrasso, current senator out of Wyoming, who was one of the senators who actually confronted the Secret Service Director Cheadle yesterday in the hallways of this very arena, asking her for accountability and explanations about how Donald Trump could be shot while at a campaign rally. You also saw him shake the hand of Ted Cruz, but also you have multiple Senate candidates up there. Those very Republican Senate candidates are trying to win seats in Wisconsin and Nevada that are currently held by the Democrats, Tom.
Vaughn, we thank you for that. I want to bring you back in here, Rodney. This is the third convention that former President Trump has to put on, right? 2016, 2024, the virtual one in 2020. They sort of figured this out, right?
Well, they certainly have. And after the assassination attempt, I think America's seen that there's been a different Donald Trump. There's been a change in his tone, a change in his rhetoric, and I think he has changed. That near-death experience.
I mean, I hear you, and I don't think you're completely wrong, but he also put out on Truth Social a picture of him with his fist, bloody face, and then Biden tripping on the steps. So, I mean, the Donald Trump we've all known for years is still alive. It's still there.
Well, look, I'm excited because we got a lot better music than I've ever heard at some other conventions I've been to. But in the end, America saw a unified Republican Party, and that's not what we've seen since 2004.
Yeah, this is the image I was talking about there. But my larger point being that people are here. You've had no drama. You had drama in 2016. 2020 was a virtual convention. But, I mean, so far, this is knock on wood, it's gone on without a hitch for Republicans.
It certainly has. Again, it's been a unified message. It's been a message about unity. There's been a lot less contrast messaging with the Democrats. And we've kind of taken a step back and stolen something from the Democrats' playbook. We let them destroy themselves.
You know, Tara, the knock on the Trump campaign, especially in 2016, was that they weren't ready for prime time. They would make silly, dumb mistakes. They weren't really a campaign. Sometimes people said they were just a Twitter account and Donald Trump rallies with a microphone. They have sort of evolved and come a long way from there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he has a totally different team. I don't think there's anyone from 2016 that's on his team right now except for Donald Trump. He has some true campaign officials who are sophisticated. He knows when to step back, when it's time to be quiet. Like, for example, this past week he's been more subdued until obviously this latest Truth Social. But yeah, he's got Susie Wiles on his team who helped Ron DeSantis win his governorship. He's got Chris LaCivita, who created the Swift Boats campaign that pretty much took out Kerry. So, you know, he's got a better, more sophisticated team. But I still think at the end of the day, Trump is playing a different game because his freedom's on the line. Let's be honest. Like, he knows that. He has a ton of legal issues, and he has to win.
Yeah.
What else is he going to do?
Because you're saying that if he doesn't, then he has to face those legal trials. If he does win, he could maybe have them dismissed.
Pretty much. much, right? I mean, even if he is sentenced to, I don't know, house arrest, I'm sure they would prolong that or any sort of prison time. That's still hanging over this entire race, which could throw the entire race off, especially if there is a new candidate. Let's not forget, we have a sentencing in September, right around early voting time.
Rodney, you're a former congressman from Illinois. The Democrats are going to have their convention there. Do you think they made a mistake in choosing Chicago just because there were so many blue states, other blue states out there that are going to be competitive, or battleground states that are going to post their convention in? Was it smart for the Republicans to be here in Milwaukee, a battleground state because of Wisconsin? Illinois, classic. Chicago, it's going to be blue. You know it's going to go blue. What do you think the play was there and the thinking there?
Well, I think, number one, it's a great city, and it's a great convention city. And they're going to figure out where do their major donors want to go, where do their delegates want to go, and that's where we picked it. Remember, we had our convention in New York in 2004. I don't think we came close.
Yeah, but then it was Cleveland. It's moved from there. So far in this convention, the way it's been executed, you've been to a lot of conventions. You think this is one of the better ones?
It really is. Look, I'm the last person people would think would be excited to vote for President Trump. He's the reason I'm not in Congress anymore. He endorsed my opponent in my primary. But I'm watching what the Trump campaign has done under the leadership, as Tara has said. I think Susie Wiles and Chris LaSavita have done a phenomenal job in keeping the messaging together this campaign. And if this disciplined messaging from Donald Trump and his team and his surrogates remain for the next few months, he's going to win in a landslide.
All right, Rodney, we appreciate that. Tara Palmieri, appreciate that as well. That's going to do it for our coverage right now of the Republican National Convention in this hour. I'm Tom Llamas in Milwaukee. We want you to stay with us. We're going to have much more. Hallie Jackson's back with me for more on this historic night as we lead into prime time. And, of course, tonight is the big night. Donald J. Trump is going to take the stage here in Milwaukee. We're going to all be watching that. Stay with NBC News Now. We're going to tap in a little bit to coverage. I'll see you on the flip side.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.